Hi guys, this lesson's about the census, and I'm going to deal with two key elements of this part of the course. First of all, with how a census is collected, and second of all, with the difficulties facing countries in collecting a census. So let's deal with the first of those two questions. How do we actually collect a census? Well, these notes largely refer to how we do this in our own country, Scotland. First of all, you need to know the term census and you need to know that it's collected every 10 years. But you can score further marks by being able to give detailed descriptions of exactly what goes on within a census. A census is, of course, that document that is sent out to every household, and it is essentially a questionnaire. That questionnaire might be about the number of people living in their home. And for giving that kind of detail, you'll score a mark. For any further detail you might be able to add, you'll gain further credit. For example, questions about social, economic and cultural background. For example, where they might answer questions about their ethnicity or their religion. A census is a great tool, but it's not the only tool that our country uses to track the growth of population. We, of course, track births and deaths, and this is known as civil registration. Once again, you get a mark for knowing what the name of the technique is, and you can score a further mark by giving some detail about how it works. If a census is only every 10 years, then it's almost immediately out of date, and to get an accurate idea of how the population is growing in between censuses taking place, we can use civil registration of births and deaths to keep an up-to-date count of the population and how it's growing or shrinking between censuses. And that's the key concept you want to get across there. In Scotland, there's also the Scottish Household Survey. This is a continuous survey. It happens all of the time, and that's worth 1 mark. And what happens is a random sample of the population are contacted, and that makes it far cheaper and more manageable to carry out than a full census, which is an enormous undertaking and very expensive for any government to carry out. Governments also collect data on migration. That is, of course, made up of immigration and emigration. Immigration with an I is people coming into the country, and emigration beginning with an E is people exiting the country. And of course, by tracking visa applications and NHS records, we can tell how the population is growing as people arrive into the country and leave. So through migration checks, household surveys, civil registration of births and deaths, and of course a census every decade, these are the principal tools that our government uses to track the growth of our population. It's quite a straightforward answer, but remember, you need to expand on each of the named methods to get full marks by giving a bit more detail. So, what are the difficulties in collecting a census? For many countries around the world, collecting a census is hugely challenging. Arguably, for all countries, it's an expensive and onerous task. It requires a lot of organisation. It requires a lot of planning. You need to be able to explain some good examples of why countries find it a challenge. One of the most fundamental reasons that it's difficult for countries to carry out a census is language barrier. Some countries have many official languages and have to translate their census forms and employ enumerators who can speak those languages. An enumerator is the term we use for a person who carries out the census. That person requires training, and clearly in some countries they would require to have language skills as well. In India, for example, there are anywhere up to 500 recognised languages or dialects, and that makes it a huge challenge for them to carry out an accurate census. The ability of a community to read and to write impacts upon not only their ability to complete the census at all, but also for them to be able to complete it accurately. And that is a really important and fundamental issue for developing countries in accurately recording how their population is growing. The sheer size of a population makes it difficult to carry out a census, and I've included a picture here of New York because I don't feel it's fair that we only ever focus on developing countries. All countries find a census a challenge, but certainly in countries like China and India, which have plus 1 billion population, it is a real difficulty to physically get enough census forms to the population and back again in a time frame that makes it sense to carry the census out. The sheer size of the population just makes it difficult. You will need to give that example of a country with a very large population, and China and India do work best here as your case studies. Many countries have huge areas that are simply inaccessible, with challenging mountainous or forest-covered terrain and poor infrastructure. By poor infrastructure, what we mean here is poor transport connections or communication links. The Amazon rainforest is, of course, a fantastic example of this, and it simply makes it physically difficult for the enumerators to distribute the census forms. Other examples exist, for example, in mountainous Nepal, where many communities are at extremely high altitude or at times of different season in the year are isolated by snow and the snowy season. It is a physical difficulty that the enumerators often just cannot get over. Conflict is a very good reason why a census can be inaccurate or difficult to collect. Some areas will just simply be too dangerous to enter. And obviously, in areas of conflict, death records are maybe not maintained accurately because it's difficult to keep track of exactly who is dying. And that can mean that the data is fundamentally flawed and inaccurate, or if it is accurately collected, it quickly becomes dated and therefore of no use. As I mentioned, collecting a census is enormously expensive. Even for Scotland, Great Britain, the USA, France, major economies, it is a very expensive process. And in developing countries, what you need to say to score a mark here is that that money that could be spent on doing a census really has to be prioritized elsewhere. And a valid example of that would be, for example, on the provision of education and healthcare. To score this mark, you don't just have to point out that it's expensive to do a census. You need to point out that the funds need to be prioritized to other more pressing needs in developing countries. Migration can, of course, mean that it becomes difficult to gather accurate data. As people move from A to B, the data you gathered will swiftly become out of date. And there are lots of examples in the world of where migration is a pressing issue. Of course, Syria grabs a lot of headlines, but also in places like Brazil, where very rapid rural to urban migration, that is people moving from the countryside to the cities, does make it very difficult for the Brazilian government to track exactly how many people they have living in the various areas of their country. A census doesn't necessarily just give you a sum total of how many people you've got, but of course it tells you where they are, and that's super important to governments in allocating resources. So migration between countries, but also within countries, can be a good way to score a mark. Shanty towns, like this one in Davari, the Davari slums, famously in India, mean that people don't have an address. So even if you did want to get a census form to those people, how would you go about doing that? There are no street names here. There is no formal postcodal address system. Again, thinking back to the picture I just showed you, talking about migration in Brazil, the Brazilian favelas, another term for a shantytown, are a great example and a challenge facing the Brazilian government in knowing exactly how many people they have and also where those people are. A further thing to consider is that where there are illegal immigrants in a country, those people are unlikely to complete a census because, in so doing, they might face deportation or at least being identified by the authorities, which of course is not in their interests. I've not included a picture here because I don't think it's appropriate for me to identify one particular group of people as likely to be an illegal immigrant. But that leads us on to nomadic people. Now, nomadic people are migratory. They are a form of migrant. A good example is the Tuareg in North Africa, which you can see I've included a map of here. And they are a nomadic group of people. Their lifestyle is based upon moving around, following seasonal rain and following cattle herd movements. Therefore, they don't necessarily respect national borders. And in this area of North Africa, national borders are not always clearly defined with a fence and a signpost. It's sometimes difficult to tell when you've wandered from Niger into Algeria. And as a result, these people can not only be missed out altogether, but often, because they are moving around during the time that the census is taking place, it's quite possible they could be counted twice. So there's two grounds upon which nomadic people can be a challenge for developing countries to count accurately. And right at the end here, there are regional differences within countries. For example, you might have ethnic tension or internal political rivalries that lead to inaccuracies. Northern Nigeria is a good example, as there are claims that their population figures for the northern half of the country have been inflated to secure better political access. Now, the two maps I've shown you, I think, are a nice window into understanding this. It is not the case, I think, or it's not fair to solely accuse the northern section of Nigeria to be falsifying their statistics to deliberately seek funds, money from the central government. I think that's too simplistic. But you can see that northern Nigeria does have, from the left-hand map, real divisions in its spread of wealth. And those divisions do lie broadly on a kind of north-south divide, especially if you look up in the northwest. And in the right-hand map, you can see that those divisions in wealth could also be reflected in other indicators of development, such as literacy amongst females. And again, that northwestern region really stands out. Now, if you were filling in a census and you were living in those areas, there might be other motivations, other factors motivating you to perhaps misreport or inflate family size numbers or community size numbers in order to get your area of Nigeria a bit more political representation, a bit more influence from the decision makers, because clearly they face their own challenges there. Okay, so those are the basic reasons why we have difficulties in collecting a census, and I've also covered the manner in which countries like Scotland carry out their census. These are the first two major questions of the population unit, and you should make sure that you've got a copy of these notes and that you use them to build your own model answers.